Good morning, everybody. I want to call to order the July 19th, 2023 meeting of the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. We have both in-person and virtual commissioners here. And Mr. Adams, can you call the roll, please?
Chair Shapiro.
Present.
Commissioner Bailey.
Present.
Commissioner Dorner.
Here.
Commissioner Giraldo.
Here.
From Montgomery, Vice Chair Harris.
Present.
Commissioner Bartley.
Present.
Commissioner Linden.
Present.
Commissioner Pettowing.
Present.
That is 8. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Adams. We have before us the commission agenda and the commission minutes from the open session on June 21, 2023. I would look for a motion to approve both this commission agenda and the commission minutes in one motion.
Move for approval.
I second.
We've got a motion by Commissioner Giraldo, a second by Vice Chair Harris. Any discussion on the motion? No discussion. Mr. Adams, could you call the roll, please?
Chair Shapiro.
Vote aye.
Commissioner Bailey.
But aye.
Commissioner Dorner.
But aye.
Commissioner Giraldo.
But aye.
Vice Chair Harris.
Vote aye.
Commissioner Bartley.
Aye.
Commissioner Linden.
Aye.
Commissioner Pettowing.
Aye.
8-0 for both motions.
Thank you, Mr. Adams. Next, under general announcements, we have a few. They're in our packet. It's Bereaved Parents Month, and we have the upcoming Hispanic Heritage Month, which will be from September 15th through October 15th. Lots and lots of wonderful activities in both counties. Looking forward to participating in that. Next, under committee minutes and board reports, the only thing, this is for information only, we have the Employee Retirement Association Board of Trustees regular meeting is on June 6, 2023. And with that, we will now move to presentation and action items. The first of which is an appointment of Mitra Pettowing to the Audit Committee. I'll turn to Vice Chair Harris for a brief notification around that.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, Chair. I'd like to say that Montgomery County Planning Board is pleased to appoint Mitra Pettowing to the Audit Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Harrison. This is not an action item, but thank you for that, and we look forward to your service in a new way. Next, we have two resolutions. These do require action, Commissioners. Resolution 2315, this is for Commissioner Hedrick to the 115 Trust, and Resolution 2316, this is Josh Linden, Commissioner Linden to the Employee Retirement System Board of Trustees. Mr. Harris, any comments on those?
No, I don't.
We'll look for a motion?
Yes, I'd like to.
Move approval.
Second.
Mr. Harris, Commissioner Giraldo beat you to it.
Okay, great.
We have a motion by Commissioner Giraldo, a second by Commissioner Bailey. Any discussion on the motion? No discussion, and this is one motion for both resolutions. Mr. Adams, can you call the roll?
Chair Shapiro.
Vote aye.
Commissioner Bailey.
But aye.
Commissioner Dorner.
But aye.
Commissioner Giraldo.
I vote aye.
Vice Chair Harris.
Aye.
Commissioner Bartley.
Commissioner Bartley, you there?
Yeah. Aye.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Linden.
Aye.
Commissioner Pettowing.
Aye.
8-0. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have item 5B on our agenda. This is recommendation for deferred comp, the 457 plan, and the Federal Secure Act 2.0. I believe Mr. Spencer and Ms. McDonald are going to be presenting these items. Are you both on the line?
Yes, we're
Good
here.
morning.
Okay.
We are.
Jennifer McDonald will be presenting. There's been some recent legislation back in December of this past year, and she's going to speak about the Secure Act and what that means for the Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Spencer. Ms. McDonald, take it away.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Jennifer McDonald, Benefits Manager, and I'm here to present some items for your approval. This is in regards to the Secure Act 2.0, Secure Act stands for setting every community up for retirement enhancement. The law was signed on December the 29th, and it's really to enhance defined contribution and defined benefit pension plans. So there were several different provisions under this law. The timing and requirements vary depending upon the provision. So my presentation will focus on some optional provisions that this new law offers to employees with 457 and other defined benefit pension plans. So we did present the information to the department heads as well as the executive committee, and they support the recommendations that I'm about to describe. So there are three recommendations. One is to allow the following provisions under this new law. One is a penalty-free withdrawal for domestic abuse victims. The second is an emergency savings withdrawal. And the third is an emergency savings account. The third item is limited to non-highly compensated employees. So for the detail, the penalty-free withdrawal for domestic abuse victims, they can request a distribution up to $10,000 or 50% of their account balance. There is no penalty. Typically, there's a 10% penalty applied to any early withdrawals. There will be no penalty applied to this withdrawal, and they may repay the loan, not a loan, but they may repay the withdrawal if they so choose. They don't have to. What's important about this is that we will rely on self-certification, meaning that the victim will not have to prove that he or she is undergoing domestic abuse. A lot of times our employees don't want to share this type of information, so the law is making it easy for these individuals to be able to withdraw their money to help them through this domestic abuse situation. Any questions about the domestic abuse withdrawal? I see Josh Linden has his hand up.
Commissioner?
Yes, thank you. I just have a point of clarification, and I apologize if you mentioned this. Are these withdrawals limited to, for example, like once per year, or is there a limit at all on kind of the number of withdrawals that can hit that cap of 10,000 or 50%?
So for this particular reason, for domestic abuse, they cannot take out a second one unless the first withdrawal was repaid. So it's only one at a time. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yeah. Thanks for that clarification. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
I have a question with regards to that. So, Ms. McDonald, when you say it's limited to one withdrawal, the question posed by Commissioner Linden raises the issue. Suppose they, within a 1-year period, they're allowed to take up to 10,000, but can they do it? For example, take 5,000 and then they take another 2,000.
Correct. So they can they can make more than one withdrawal, but the maximum is 10,000.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Okay, the next item is there's another question?
No.
I think
I was
there's no more
thinking-
questions, Ms. McDonald. You're back. We're back to you.
All right. The next item is emergency withdrawals. This will allow a participant to withdraw $1,000 for emergencies. Currently, a participant can withdraw money only if they're undergoing an unforeseen emergency hardship, and they are defined by the IRS. This particular provision will allow a participant to take up to $1,000. Again, it's self-certified. We don't adjudicate, we don't review it, neither does Mission Square, our 457 plan administrator. Again, it's $1,000. It's things such as a family emergency that doesn't meet that more stringent criteria under the emergency hardship withdrawal. Again, it's self-certified, the 10% penalty is waived, and it requires replenishment before a subsequent withdrawal is made.
Questions?
Any
So
questions?
on the 10% penalty, are we going to be withholding that for them in case it does not actually qualify under the IRS rules? Or what are we going to do about that? Because there's certain categories that actually qualify for not having the 10% penalty. And if somebody is claiming emergency savings withdrawals but actually is subject to that, how are we going to deal with that penalty, if at all? Or are we just going to assume that's on the individual?
That we are taken out of the equation, so if that individual is audited by the IRS and it's deemed that it was not a true emergency, then they will be responsible for the penalty.
And are we going to provide some sort of guidance, at least a link to the IRS page that has like the categories, or how do we, are we going to help people basically avoid that in case they make a mistake?
Yes, once we make the decision that we will approve these, allow these options, we will provide education, brochures, webinars. We will have an educational campaign. And at the time a participant requests one of these, we will again reinforce and reiterate the consequences.
Okay. All right, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, the third option is an emergency savings account. This will allow a participant to put money, to contribute money to their 457, so it's going to be embedded in their 457 plan. This money will be contributed on a post-tax basis, like a Roth contribution, so you're already paying taxes on it. You can save up to $2,500 in this account. If it goes over, then it will be moved to your regular 457 account. Again, this does not require any particular emergency or hardship. It's like a savings account where in some of our participants think that they can just borrow money or take money out of their 457, but remember the 457 is for retirement. And because we've had this issue where participants, employees come to us, they want to take money out, we think this is a good idea because they can put this money aside as $2,500 to be used at any time for any reason. Again, penalty-free, and no certification is required that they, for the reason they want to take this withdrawal. And this is only for non-highly compensated employees. So highly compensated employees for 2024 are those who earn more than $150,000 in the previous year, in 2023. Of course, that's indexed as for each year.
I think we have a question, Ms. McDonald. Commissioner Dorner?
Good assumption. Yeah, we're going to have withdrawals that are going to be allowed between the accounts, so you can actually do the like a rollover from your existing account, your 457 to this, or are we going to not prohibit that? And if we're going to allow it, is it going to be limited to one per year, or what are we going to do?
But we will continue to allow withdrawal from any money that you rolled over into the current 457 plan. So we will not take that away. And this again,
That wasn't exactly what I asked. When you convert between Roth and 401k like traditionals, there's sort of backdoor rollovers that you can do between accounts, but it depends on the actual administrator and whether or not they permit rollovers between accounts, or it's basically a transfer between them. So if somebody has over $2,500 in their 457, are we going to permit like a one-time per year rollover that they could take that amount, put it into the emergency savings, and then pay the appropriate taxes upon that if it's in a traditional, not Roth version of the account?
I assume so. I don't know the definite answer, but based on what I think, yes, they will be able to do so. But I can get clarification.
Okay, we should probably find that out, because depending on how we're thinking about this program, like what you said a moment ago in terms of people using the 457s like savings accounts, we might want to say no, that you can't do the rollover between accounts, because then that would be essentially what you're saying, that they put it into 457 and then they've used it as a savings account, they just roll it over.
Yeah.
And they've got that money in there, and then every single year they continue to roll over, so they always have the 2,500 in
Into
there.
that, yeah.
Yeah, so.
Which defeats the whole purpose, yeah.
Precisely. So you just might want to think about how we want that to operate. I wouldn't be opposed to having like a one-time rollover that people could do every couple years or something, just to at least get up to the 2,500, because there might be legitimate reasons that they need to access that money. Maybe there's some sort of a disaster in their house and they want to do repairs or whatever. And it's difficult to get up to the 2,500 by contributing every pay period, whereas they could immediately get to that through their 457 with a rollover, and they would just only have to pay the taxes if it's coming out of a non-taxable account. So you might want to think about, do we limit it per year or every couple of years in terms of a number of times that they could roll over if we permit it?
Okay. I will try to get an answer before the end of this meeting. I'll reach out to Mission Square and get an answer for you.
Okay, and we probably also want to specify that it's only contributions that have gone by the person into their 457, and it's not any matched contributions, because that would
Right.
create other problems.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions?
So that concludes my presentation. Any additional questions?
No other questions? Thank you, Ms. McDonald, appreciate it. For Commissioner Dorner, I'm assuming that we'll be able to take action on this. You do have an outstanding question. I'm not sure whether in your mind that stops us from taking action until we get that information.
No, I think this is just a clarification that we should offer and have, but I don't think it would stop me from supporting the motion.
Okay, so we'll have staff get back to us with that, get Commissioner Dorner and the rest of us with that information. And if there's no further questions or comments on this issue, then I would look for a motion to adopt staff's recommendations relating to these three enhancements for the deferred comp plan. Is there a motion?
Move approval.
Second.
Got a motion, was that Commissioner Giraldo? It was?
Yes, it was.
Okay, and a second by Commissioner Dorner. Discussion on the motion? Mr. Adams, can you call the roll, please?
Chair Shapiro.
Vote aye.
Commissioner Bailey.
But aye.
Commissioner Dorner.
Aye.
Commissioner Giraldo.
Aye.
Vice Chair Harris.
Aye.
Commissioner Bartley.
Aye.
Commissioner Linden.
Aye.
Commissioner Pettaway.
Aye.
8-0, thank you.
Thank you. Next item is 5C on our agenda. This is a budget transfer request. We'll turn to Ms. Knappe for a brief overview of what this action item is before us.
Good morning, I'm Kitty Knappe, Deputy Corporate Budget Director, and I'm requesting your approval of a budget transfer to the FY24 salary markers out of the non-departmental accounts and distribute them to the respective departments.
Thank you, Ms. Knappe. Commissioner, is there any questions on this item? If there are none, I'd look for a motion to act on this budget transfer request.
Move approval.
I second.
Second.
We've got a motion by Commissioner Giraldo, I believe, a second by Vice Chair Harris. Any discussion on the motion? No discussion. Mr. Adams, please call the roll.
Chair Shapiro.
Vote aye.
Commissioner Bailey.
But aye.
Commissioner Dorner.
Aye.
Commissioner Giraldo.
Vote aye.
Vice Chair Harris.
Vote aye.
Commissioner Bartley.
Aye.
Commissioner Linden.
Aye.
Commissioner Pettaway.
Aye.
That's 8-0, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Adams. Next item on our agenda is 5D. I'm looking forward to this presentation. This is the Mapping Segregation Project. Acting Planning Director Tanya Stern, or members of her team, and/or members of her team will giving the presentation, and we'll turn it over to you, Ms. Stern.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be before the full commission this morning for the Montgomery County Planning Department to give a briefing to you on our mapping segregation project. I'm just going to give a very, very brief introduction and then turn it over to Rebecca Ballo, who is our Historic Preservation Office Supervisor, who will give the briefing, and we will be available to answer questions. The Mapping Segregation Project is a really important effort that supports Montgomery Planning's Equity Agenda for Planning, which is our department-wide initiative to make equity a foundational part of our work. We've done quite a number of different initiatives to implement that, and so the mapping segregation is one of our latest efforts. It is also very important because it helps to support Montgomery County's racial equity initiatives. The county has a racial equity and social justice law, and so our department is definitely endeavoring to help to support the county's efforts to make the county more equitable for all of our residents that we serve. And then lastly, and why this is a part of our Historic Preservation Office is that this effort helps to document the history of racially restrictive in-housing segregation in a county, particularly during the 20th century. There were, I think, probably a lot of assumptions about what happened in a county, and this is an effort where we actually went and looked at the records and can actually document it. And so with that, I will turn it over to Rebecca Ballo to walk us through the presentation. Oh, and then I can also, I'm sorry to interrupt, Rebecca, just wanted to also acknowledge Jason Sartori. He is our chief of the Countywide Planning and Policy Division, of which our Historic Preservation Office is a part.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for having me. My name is Rebecca Ballo, for the record, the Cultural Resources Supervisor with Montgomery Planning. And on behalf of the department and the project team, I'm so pleased to be here and to share our report with you this morning. I'm going to share out my screen. Give me one moment. Is that sharing out yet?
Yes.
It is? Okay.
There we go.
Yes.
We got it.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you. So again, thank you for having me this morning. The complete white paper and staff report that our office presented to the Montgomery County Planning Board from December is included in your packet. So the goal of my presentation this morning, I'm going to be summarizing some of the history that was in that white paper, while also weaving that through a discussion of explaining the maps that we have in our GIS. Right. So our project had multiple objectives, as listed here on the screen, but we felt that the most fruitful means of examining racial segregation within patterns of land use came from an analysis of racial restrictive covenants in Montgomery County. The project was first described as a key goal of the Planning Department's Equity Agenda in Planning in 2020, with the recommendation that the Historic Preservation Office explore developing a historical, what we call a redlining mapping tool. That initial scope developed into what we now call the Mapping Segregation Project. It was an effort to better answer the question, what are the redlined communities in Montgomery County? And then given the historic settlement patterns in our suburban communities, from the earliest platted areas in Silver Spring to the streetcar suburbs and later to the auto-centric suburbs, that question, what were the redline communities, it didn't seem to actually capture the issue of what does legal racial discrimination in the suburbs around the central city, around Washington, D.C., really look like. So the project team believed that the maps and the data that we developed as part of this project have given us a better framework to discuss and to examine this legacy. So today I'll begin by describing very briefly the different federal agencies that promulgated discriminatory housing practices in their policies and lending programs. I'll discuss the proliferation of racial restrictive covenants within the Down County planning area. I'll discuss certain court cases, the Tushin case that galvanized the Jewish community in Washington, D.C. and across the country, highlight certain civil rights figures that were very important to the history of Montgomery County. And then I'll discuss the results of a case study where we explored the relationship of racial covenants with Black homeownership in Tacoma Park. And then I'll end with our key takeaways from the project. So I always like to start the presentation of the topic with this slide. So it depicts the dramatic shift in the population of Montgomery County from 1890 to 1960. So again, the project began with the desire to discover through the land records how the geography of racial exclusion and racial steering was created and enforced in the county, and the impacts this had foremost on the African American community. The researchers were also directed to record all discriminatory language found in the records, including restrictions against any racial, religious, or ethnic minority group. When we started, we were aware of these demographics for the African American community, and you will see later in the presentation the breakdown of the restrictive covenants as they were applied to various groups. But it's important to remember that in all instances, 100% of the racial restrictive covenants that we found targeted African Americans. So back to the slide and the charts. So Black residents went from comprising about 36% of the population of the county in 1890 to 3% in 1960. During that period, the white population increased by over 310,000 people, while the Black population increased by a little more than 1,800. The team set forth to explain why this occurred and share how discrimination targeting racial and ethnic communities by the government and private citizens happened at nearly all levels of society in Montgomery County. Historians and demographers nationwide are exploring primarily 3 different avenues to discuss and analyze the history and legacy of legal discriminatory housing practices. I also include this slide in the presentation to explain that this is not just work that we are doing here in Montgomery County with the Commission. It's not just work that's being done in Washington, D.C., but this is a national conversation. The Federal Reserve is looking at these issues. Research universities are looking at these issues as well. So most scholarship has examined the actions of 2 federal agencies, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the HOLC, and the Federal Housing Administration. Both organizations legitimized and spread redlining at the federal level and drove real estate lending and building practices to the detriment of people of color. Again, redlining refers to mortgage lending decisions based on the location or physical characteristics of a property and its owners. So fewer researchers are documenting the use and impact of racial restrictive covenants, likely due to the labor required for such a study. Racial restrictive covenants are private contractual agreements that prohibit the sale, rent, lease, or occupation of property to particular racial, ethnic, and religious groups. You find this information in the land records, in the deeds, declaration of covenants, and other agreements. Hold on. So our staff focus on racial restrictive covenants because of 2 conditions. The HOLC, as an agency, it only existed for a very short period of time, from about 1933 to 1935. But it was during this phase that it created its notorious redlining maps for a little over 200 communities in America. However, the HOLC maps for the Washington, D.C., for the center city and the region, either never existed or they have been lost. And this is a condition that historians and researchers have been dealing with for the last 40 years as we've been trying to research this question. There simply are no HOLC maps for Washington, D.C. Here we have on the slide, however, the HOLC map from Baltimore. And then looking at the FHA data, the FHA data is not easily accessible in the land records. There is one FHA residential sub-area map for Washington, D.C., and you can see that here on the right. But the sub-area map is limited in geography in relation to the county, and we also found that it had major omissions. So this map has been included in our GIS layer for people to click on the different grades of housing. But what we immediately noticed with this map is that while it does include the African American community in Tacoma Park, it completely omits the major African American communities in Littonsville and River Road, really calling into question how useful it would be for us in the first place. So there are just fewer opportunities for us to use any of this data. So on the other hand, the racial restrictive covenants, those are part of the land records. They remain intact for the entire planning area and are accessible to, to the project team. So back to the covenants. And this is an example of a deed record with a racial restrictive covenant shown here on the screen, and there are others in the report. So real estate developers, neighborhood associations, and property owners used racial restrictive covenants to create homogeneous white neighborhoods and prohibit home ownership and occupancy by non-whites with the belief that this would maintain or improve residential property values. It is important to reiterate that these covenants are not enforced by the local government, but they require your neighbors to bring other parties to court. They are private contractual relationships. The Supreme Court ruled these covenants were unenforceable in 1948, but private property owners could continue to write them into the land records until the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968. So, again, I mentioned that this work is being done at a national scale. So how is this work being done? One is by a parcel-by-parcel analysis. A researcher could take every individual parcel record back to the late 1800s, basically a title or a deed search, and look for racial covenants in the deeds. This is a very time-consuming process. The other method is to supplement this approach with machine learning, where computer AI can search for keywords, but individuals still need to fact-check, document, and log the data. So while you may capture some covenants, it could still take years of work. The Mapping Prejudice Project, which I have a screenshot here for you to see from their website. This project is being conducted out of the University of Minneapolis, Minnesota. It is the most comprehensive analysis of racial restrictive covenants in the country. And the slide shows the total number of volunteer hours, deeds transcribed, and the number of volunteers involved in the project is shown on their website. So over 33,000 volunteer hours, 80,000 deeds transcribed, and over 6,000 volunteer hours. We simply did not have these types of resources to bring to bear for this project. So we approached the project at the subdivision plat level with a sampling method for each plat. And I'm going to walk through the methodology for you. So we asked our GIS team to send us all the plats within the Down County planning area, as shown partially on the left. This is what you get when you click on our GIS for all the plats. So when you click on one of the polygons, you can pull up the actual plat. And here we can get the name of the owner or the company that subdivided the land. And then we use the land records to see if that person or corporation recorded covenants. So we did not do every single property, every single parcel within the land area. We just looked at the plats, and then we did a selective sampling of properties within that platted region. So due to our project limitations, we used the sampling method for the 1,763 plats recorded prior to 1953 in the Down County. And staff found that properties associated with 728 of the record plats, so that's about 41%, included racial restrictive covenants. An additional 63 of the plats, about 4%, likely included properties with racial restrictive covenants. So what I mean by likely is that if you had a subdivision where sections 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9, and 10 all have covenants recorded, but the one outlier did not, we still performed the selective sampling, but we actually assumed that there are restrictive covenants on that one outlier, given if it was the same developer, who put them on all of the rest of his properties, and we showed that slightly differently on the map. So as we look at this map for subdivisions recorded between 1904 and 1952, it is important to remember several key points. So this is our total map of the Down County area that was produced. So this map again shows the trends from the selective sampling. It does not document covenants at the parcel by parcel level. The public would need to conduct deed research to confirm whether racial covenants were placed on their individual properties. But with that being said, the red shaded areas had racial restrictive covenants. The pink shaded areas possibly had covenants, and the blue shaded areas had no covenants that we could find. It is critical to understand, though, that the areas that were shaded in blue still did not welcome black residents. De facto and de jure segregation occurred throughout the county. So the previous map often raises questions about what are all the gaps. So here's the same map, but the gray shaded areas that included all recorded subdivisions after 1953 are pulled up. So these are the recorded plats that we didn't investigate. We took the project to approximately 4 years after the passage of Shelley versus Kramer because we figured we would see the number of covenants decline. We did, and I'm going to get into that data decade by decade, and then we just stopped the project at 1952. Again, we needed a reasonable stopping point, and we felt that that captured enough data to be useful. So this slide shows the information the users see when they click on a polygon on our mapping tool in the GIS. So you can pull up the survey plat, the property owner, covenant text, where we had our researchers type in the language from the deeds so you could see specifically the groups that were being discriminated against. And we also have a lot of information about black home ownership in Tacoma Park for several decades, and black home ownership statistics and pins for 1 decade that I'll get into a little bit later. Sorry. So I'm going to walk through the spread of racial covenants in Montgomery County decade by decade as we see these covenants, we see them rise and then we see them fall off. So this map shows new subdivisions created between 1904 and 1909. In the Down County, developers and owners used the covenants sparingly at first. So examples include the 3rd and 4th additions to Chevy Chase and Silver Spring Park. So it was 6 out of the 27 that we looked at had the covenants. So here's the language from the county's first known recorded racial covenant in 1904. Robert Holt Easley, a real estate speculator from Virginia, subdivided Silver Spring and Silver Spring Park and added the displayed racial restrictive covenant. These covenants combined racial segregation with nuisance law, public health, and ideas about racial purity. So in the next decade, 1910 to 1919, real estate developers included racial restrictive covenants in properties associated with 12 of the 36 recorded plats. So here it ticks up to about 33%. Subdivisions included Edgewood, Bradley Hills, Cabin John Park, Chevy Chase Park, and Hillcrest in Tacoma Park. So returning to our map analysis, so between 1920 and 1933, there is an increase in the percent of record plats associated with the covenants. It increases, now we have slightly more than half, 53% of the plats recorded had racial covenants, whereas the slight minority, 47%, did not. And it was also during this period that covenants spread to other ethnic and religious groups aside from just targeting African Americans. In 1932, covenants adjacent to Seven Oaks included restrictions against people of Asian descent, and the following year, in 1933, the Loughborough Development Corporation discriminated against people of Jewish descent. The term quote-unquote Semitic races appeared in almost all the conveyances associated with properties that discriminated against Jews. While the racial description of Semitic included various groups, the developers intended to discriminate primarily against Jewish residents. So the next period shown on the map represents the creation of the Federal Housing Administration in 1934, prior to the Supreme Court's ruling in Shelley versus Kramer in 1948. The court found in that case that the judicial enforcement of racial restrictive covenants violated the 14th Amendment. And while they would no longer be enforced by the state, such covenants could still be written into deeds as a form of deterrence. So during this time frame, properties associated with 53% of the record plats included the covenants. There were 5 times as many restrictive covenants as in the previous period. So the number of racial restrictive covenants targeting Jewish residents increased dramatically in this period. This trend corresponds with anti-immigrant and anti-Jewish rhetoric spreading across America and the start of the expanding Jewish community in Montgomery County. Most of these subdivisions were located on the western side of the down county, but there were still a few just up Georgia Avenue in the central parts and a few on the east side of the county as well. So racial covenants against Jewish residents culminated with a lawsuit filed in Bannockburn Heights. In 1947, 5 of 52 households filed a lawsuit in the Montgomery County Circuit Court in Rockville to force Lucille Tushin, a Christian, to evict Aaron Tushin, her Jewish husband, from their jointly owned family home on Wilson Lane. The suit claimed, quote, irreparable damage caused by his occupancy in violation of the restrictive covenant. The Tushin family requested and received legal assistance from the Anti-Defamation League. After local and national coverage of the incident and community support of the family, including a lead editorial from the Washington Post, which underscored the anti-Americanness of the plaintiff's actions, the residents dropped the lawsuit. The Anti-Defamation League described the case as, quote, a victory for the good sense and goodwill of the Washington community. Despite this one encouraging incident, in 1947 there was wholesale indulgence in the restrictive covenant or in the use of unwritten rules to bar persons of Jewish faith from purchasing or residing in certain properties in and around the nation's capital. So continuing on, the project team reviewed all the down county planning area plats recorded between 1949 and 1952. So as I said, we collected data for 4 years after the Supreme Court found covenants unenforceable. So properties associated with 126 of the 416 record plats included the covenants. However, properties associated with 50 of these, they were subject to existing covenants from previous land conveyances. So these were re-subdivisions. So therefore, if you subtract those out, the number of the new covenants dropped to about 76 of the 416, so 76 new ones. So we would expect the number of new covenants to continue to fall until they are fully outlawed in 1968. But again, given the time and staffing constraints that we had for this project, we did not actually examine the record plats after 1953. So, in fact, the Shelley versus Kramer decision appears to have had a minimal impact to the demographics of the county with respect to black home ownership. White flight from the District of Columbia contributed to another massive population increase in the suburbs. Between 1950 and 1960, the county's population increased from 164,000 to about 341,000 residents, with the white population increasing by over 110%. But the black population grew not at the same rate at all. So the black population of the county, again from 1950 to 1960, only increased by 11%, which was by approximately just 1,200 people. So it was during this period that the FHA slowly amended their policy to no longer permit racial covenants in the deeds. They did this by 1950. But the agency remained silent on who a property owner could sell or rent to. Therefore, voluntary discrimination remained in full force, and the actions of the federal government and real estate developers were strengthened by the decisions of individual community members, the hands-off approach of the local government, and the apathy of the general public. So these types of gentlemen's agreements or handshake agreements and the collusion of the local real estate community still kept these suburbs segregated. So even after the Shelley versus Kramer decision in 1948 and the FHA barring the use of the covenants for properties that they backed the mortgages for in 1950, we're going through the 1950s and the 1960s, and Black Americans who attempted to purchase homes in these previously covenanted areas still continued to experience protests, threats, threats of arson and violence, the withholding of financing from mortgage lenders or otherwise unfavorable terms. Real estate professionals wouldn't show them houses in the neighborhood, and then these private agreements between lenders and improvement associations to prohibit sales to people of color. So I wanted to highlight the case here of Dr. James Roberts, who is an accomplished obstetrician and gynecologist at Freedman's Hospital, who desired to move to White Oak in the late 1950s. When he tried to purchase a house, local banks denied his loan, and members of the Civic Association tried to purchase the property from under him when it became public that he intended to buy. But Dr. Roberts would not be deterred. He acquired the property, and he lived there until his death. Mary Betters, formerly Mary Williams, was the president of the Montgomery County branch of the NAACP in the 1950s, and she documented her family's struggle to find housing in an all-white neighborhood near Veers Mill. In 1961, the real estate agent quoted the Williams family a higher price than advertised and refused to accept their deposit on the house. In the end, the real estate agency released the property owners from their contract with the firm, and the family sold directly to Mary Williams and her husband. On the screen, we have an excerpt of her testimony before a congressional hearing, though, in 1961, about the continued threats of violence that she and her family faced in the neighborhood. It was through the efforts of the African American community, civil rights and fair housing activists, and other allies that eventually led to the passage of the public accommodation and fair housing legislation here in Montgomery County in the 1960s. But I include this information in the report, and there's a lot more of it in the report, and I touch on it here just to underscore that even though these mechanisms are outlawed, the practices still continued for decades afterwards. So here is a summary slide showing discrimination against particular groups of people that we saw in the land records. All of the covenants the team documented discriminated against African Americans, and a quarter of the covenants discriminated against people of Jewish descent. Less than 2% of the covenants discriminated against Asian Americans. So next, the project team recorded single-family housing covenants in the land records. More often than not, there were numerous covenants within a particular property or subdivision. One of the common covenants which further limited communities along socioeconomic and racial lines were the single-family housing covenants. There we go. So here's a map of all the single-family housing covenants that the team recorded in the Down County planning area. So this is all also available on the GIS, and I'm going to walk you through really quickly what the mapping tool shows people. So users of the map can examine the following information when clicking on a polygon. It includes the subdivision name, covenant text, and expiration date for the covenant. The expiration is important here because these covenants could still run with the land. They could still be in effect. For example, this covenant that I've pulled up here for Woodside Park states that the covenant remained in effect until the first day of January 1950, when it shall cease and terminate. So other covenants provided less specific language. Here are all the single-family housing covenants that had no explicit expiration. So when you're in the GIS map and you toggle these layers on and off, you can see pretty clearly what were the total number of the single-family covenants, and then you can remove those that are presumed to have expired. And you see the ones left that are still active. So here are where the single-family covenants existed absent any racial restrictive covenants. And again, these covenants were another layer that dictated exclusivity of the suburbs along racial and socioeconomic lines. So in support of the Takoma Park Minor Master Plan Amendment, the team focused on Takoma Park and used the area as a test case for potential future phases of the project. We really tried to dig down into the data about Black home ownership in the city and what effects the covenants may or may not have had on the growth of the Black community and any racial steering that may have taken place. So there were fewer racial restrictive covenants percentage-wise in Takoma Park, but we wanted to explore the interplay between the growth of the Black communities and the use of the covenants. So within Takoma Park, and you can see the map the city here on the right, and then we've broken that into a pie chart on the left. About 82% of the record plats did not have covenants, about 16% did, and then for 2% of them it was possible. So to accomplish this, the team needed to track Black home ownership in Tacoma Park. We looked at 4 different census years, 1900, 1920, 1940, and 1950. So the process included reviewing each page of the census, recording Black homeowners and renters, and the race is called out in the census data, and then cross-referencing each owner with the land records to find an associated property. So the deed record would then provide us with a plat, block, and lot number, which we would then use with the plat record and MC Atlas to determine the current address. We had to go through all of these steps because most of the census data before 1950 didn't list an address, and if it did, the address doesn't correlate to our present-day street and house numbering system. So this next series of maps provides a timeline of covenants and shows the interplay between the covenants and the location and rate of Black home ownership in Tacoma Park. So you can see the outline of the city here is shown in this dashed black line. And the first known Black homeowners in Tacoma Park were Lewis and Grace Thomas, who worked as a caterer and a nurse. Mr. Thomas acquired his property at 15 Montgomery Avenue in 1896, and the 1900 census lists them as the only Black homeowners in Tacoma Park, but there were 7 other families that rented in nearby houses. So there were 40 Black residents in the city at the time. So you can see on the left is the map from the 1900 census data, and that one little orange pin, that's where the Thomases lived on 15 Montgomery Avenue. So the Black community had its period of greatest growth, actually, between 1900 and 1920. The population grew to 203 residents, so that's an increase of over 400%. 13 families owned property, and an additional 27 families rented. So the Black-owned homes were dispersed throughout the city, and only one racial restrictive covenant existed at Hillcrest. So then you see on the right here in 1920, the pins are dispersed throughout the map. The pink shaded areas are the racial covenants. And there doesn't seem to be, a relationship there yet. So between 1920 and 1940, Black homeownership in Tacoma Park continued to increase, and by 1940, there were almost an equal number of homeowners and renters. And the overall population had expanded to 304 residents. So we're still talking like very small numbers of people. However, during this period, properties associated with at least 18 subdivisions included racial restrictive covenants, which channeled and concentrated the Black community's growth into 3 distinct areas. These became known as the Hill, located at Oswego, Geneva, and Ritchie Avenues, the Bottom near Colby Avenue, and another smaller unnamed community on Poplar Avenue. The Hill included the First Baptist Church of Tacoma Park, built in 1922, and the Tacoma Park Rosenwald School, built in 1928. In 1950, Black homeownership in Tacoma Park had increased to its highest levels in the 20th century. There were a total of 445 residents, but the inclusion of racial restrictive covenants in the previous decade continued to isolate and concentrate the community. And we think that the map shows this, very clearly, as the orange pins show the homeowners who are starting to congregate in these areas, and then the covenants, the racial covenants in the subdivision plats start to be created all around these communities. So clicking on the pins, so those orange pins for each Black homeowner, will also pull up detailed information about that person and the building. So we recorded the primary residence, the number of people in each household, the occupation of the residents, the years they acquired the property, who provided their mortgages, which is a really interesting data point. A lot of it seems to have been through early savings and loans, but that would be an interesting sort of research side quest into what banks and what individuals were providing the financing for these Black homeowners. And we also recorded whether or not the house is still standing. So this information we think will be invaluable as we consider this area for any type of historic designation, or as we write about the area for the upcoming master plan. There are two other examples of discriminatory housing practices in Tacoma Park that I just like to highlight. One relates to reactive racial restrictive covenants, and the other to the actions of a local civic association. So the blue areas outlined here show the approximate boundaries of a reactive racial restrictive covenant. So these are different than the ones that are put on by the developer who is platting the land. So in May 1947, property owners in Tacoma Park agreed to a new declaration of covenants that they enacted themselves with the sole purpose of restricting the sale of property to Black residents. So this was an after-the-fact declaration agreed to by each party of the community. So this was brought to our attention by an outside researcher, and our methodology when we were just looking at the record plats does not capture these cases comprehensively because we didn't look through each individual parcel within the study area. So in addition, the Lincoln Valley Citizens Association took another step to further isolate the Black community within their boundaries. So this yellow area, this is the geographic area of the Lincoln Valley Citizens Association. These pins show the Black community along Colby Avenue. So the Citizens Association, their bylaws limited membership, it's highlighted here, limited their membership to Caucasians only. So therefore the Black residents on Colby Avenue had to form their own civic association in order to lobby the city for fair services, in order to speak in front of the city government, and in order to ask for the same things that the larger Citizens Association would be asking for anyways, but only on behalf of their white residents. So we thought that this was actually a very successful case study, and it led us to expand our documentation of Black homeowners to the entire Down County planning area, but only for 1940. So we identified a total of 97 Black homeowners in 1940, which accounted we found 97 Black homeowners in the Down County in this area, and there were 4 main communities: Littonsville, Tacoma Park, Hawkins Lane, and River Road. We did not account for Black renters in any of these other communities. We just felt that that was outside the scope of what we could do. So then we played around with different ways in the map to show this data. So here's a map showing the relationship between Black homeownership in 1940 and all the racial restrictive covenants. These areas that are sort of lit up like a heat map, these are the Black communities juxtaposed against the covenants. And here is the map with the pins representing Black homeowners. So similar to the other maps, you can click on the pin to pull up information about all of these individuals that we were able to just pull from the land records. Oops, sorry. So this map, this adds the location of the single-family housing covenants, which precluded Black homeowners as well because of the homes had to be of a certain size. You had to spend X number of $1,000s to build homes in these areas. So again, here are the Black homeowners. Here's the racial restrictive covenants, and then here are the architectural covenants as well overlaid. So that really concludes my discussion about the maps. I do want to give you some information about our outreach efforts, feedback, and engagement with the public. The project has been featured in national news. It was featured in the Washington Post and in other local interest articles. There were articles in the Washington Business Journal, Bethesda Magazine, Washington Jewish Week. When we presented the project, we presented twice to the Montgomery County Planning Board in December and January. The mapping tool had nearly 12,000 views, with the majority occurring near the release of the Washington Post article. And again, I'm told by my GIS team that this is quite a large number of views, in particular for a historic preservation project. So we were really gratified with the level of engagement from the public. Our team has also held meetings with the City of Alexandria, with the Capital Jewish Museum, the Greater Capital Area Association of Realtors. We presented a conference panel at Montgomery History, and we've been asked to come out and speak at several neighborhood associations this past spring, this summer. And we have an upcoming briefing for the City of Tacoma Park in September. So these panels here I'd like to highlight as well. Speaking with the historians at the Capital Jewish Museum, they used the maps, they used some of the information from our report in a larger comprehensive historical exhibit about discrimination in the Washington, D.C. suburbs at large that was very well received. Another part of our education and outreach, we always include this slide when we're presenting publicly, to neighborhoods or to the boards. So this is the State of Maryland Restrictive Covenant Modification Intake Sheet. A number of the neighborhoods that we've presented to have been interested in getting the information about this sheet. First of all, learning that it exists. People can fill out the form, submit it to the Land Records Department in Rockville. Their office will review it. The county attorney will find the original deed containing the restrictive language, and then the language will be struck from the land record going forward. If you still carry the land record back, you can see the unredacted language, but this will redact it within the property record moving forward. So our key takeaways from the project were that legal, systemic, and institutional discriminatory housing practices were pervasive in the county. We think the project provides a better understanding of the geography of racial exclusion by researching these practices in our down county planning area. We are confident that the newly available data and maps will be utilized by researchers in the future and can be utilized potentially to help inform future policy and planning efforts. And again, the publicly accessible data and maps have already allowed for new lines of inquiry by historians and the public, and we are very, very gratified to include information that has expanded upon and honored the history of Black property ownership and activism, and has helped all of us to understand the trends in housing discrimination against racial and religious minorities. So that is the conclusion of my part of the presentation, and this is the contact information for the team. John Lieberts was our project lead. He managed the term contract employees that performed all this research, worked with the GIS team, and authored the white paper. He's in my section, and then my division chief, Jason Sartori, and then we have here, for your benefit and for any folks watching at home, the link to the project page. And that concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Truly, truly wonderful. Let me turn to my fellow commissioners. Are there any questions or comments or thoughts or even reactions to what we've heard?
Excellent presentation.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I see Commissioner Pedoeem has her hand up.
Commissioner Pedoeem?
Yes, that was really fascinating, Rebecca. I had not seen this presentation before. That was my first time that I saw that. And the work that you guys have put into it is amazing. And it's very much heart-wrenching and also, eye-opening to see that. I understand that due to lack of resources, you just did the downtown Montgomery County. I am just wondering that how this kind of pattern of discrimination could relate to other parts of county and the state of Maryland. Any idea how it is? I just assume that you picked Down County because that's the oldest and probably the first populated areas. But there are some other areas in the county, and I'm sure in the state of Maryland that they have it. I just don't know that how this represents the other areas of the county. How could we go for that to realize that how bad, or maybe not as bad, it was everywhere else in the county or in the state of Maryland?
Thank you, Commissioner Pedoeem. These covenants definitely existed in what we call the mid-county area, and we picked the down county for several reasons. As you said, we received a limited amount of funding from the council to undertake the project, and the methodology that we were testing with looking at the plats was new. As I said, when other people were tackling this work, they were doing it parcel by parcel. So we needed to figure out another way to get at this. So we chose the down county. It was artificially but geographically limited. we already had evidence of some of these records in subdivisions that we had researched in Silver Spring, and we felt that it was a manageable area to test the methodology. And we also knew there were several African American communities already established in the Down County that predated when racial covenants tended to become prominent within the land records. Now I will say, those same conditions pretty much exist in the Mid-County area as well. The kinship community in Emery Grove, Kengar in Kensington, other smaller kinship African-American communities, the Scotland community, which is another post-emancipation community that is located just outside the Beltway, has these very same conditions. And Kensington, Garrett Park, other subdivisions were platted and settled at roughly the same time as some of the older ones in the Down County area. Some of the research that we did for the Veers Mill plan that was just adopted we looked at some of the subdivisions in the 1940s just at a cursory level. We also found the covenants there. So to answer your question, I think we would find this same information in the Mid-County area were we to move ahead with the project for another phase, to receive more funding, to get more researchers, to do the work. I expect this pattern to be pervasive and certainly in existence in the Mid-County. I don't know if Director Stern has other thoughts about that you'd like to add.
Sure. We actually talked quite a bit about this with the county councils, Montgomery County Council's Planning, Housing, and Parks Committee when we did a briefing on Monday. And we actually had requested funding for a phase 2 as part of the FY24 budget and got feedback from the committee that they wanted to understand what the scope of that could be. So we decided to brief them on the project first. And again, we had quite a robust discussion. And you know, as Rebecca noted, we do know other parts of the county where these types of covenants exist. And so moving forward, we are talking internally about doing an updated scope for phase 2. I think the Mid-County area is definitely on the table, but we're going to go. We're anticipating to go back to the council with a request for an additional phase, for funding for an additional phase to continue this research.
That's wonderful. Thanks. I'm hoping that there is no more of this kind of things. I just, you know, you are hoping and you think it doesn't exist, but you never know. You know, I'm starting to believe that, not to believe what I think it should be the right thing. So I hope that they are gone. Thank you.
Thank you. We have Commissioner Bartley, then Commissioner Linden.
Thanks, Ms. Ballo, for the presentation. It was excellent. I particularly found powerful slide number 4, where it showed the African-American population in Montgomery County in 1890, and then the African-American population in Montgomery County in 1960. That was quite telling. What would have been even more interesting is to know whether or not there was a migration from, you know, Montgomery County to other places in the state, and whether or not the state population changed at that time. But that was a powerful slide. One of the things I find interesting is the correction of a historical record. So I'm speaking from a lawyer's perspective. And you did a great job in referencing Supreme Court decisions and the Fair Housing Act, and giving a history of racial discrimination in the county with regards to racial covenants. But one of the things that I find interesting is the erasing of history, right? So the racial covenants existed, they're no longer enforceable, and nobody engages in that behavior anymore. As a matter of fact, he pointed out that James Robert, the physician, wanted to move him White Oak, and he faced great discrimination and pushback. But now White Oak, I think, is predominantly minority and not predominantly African American minority. And so erasing the historical record really has no effect, and I'm curious about wanting to erase that because it acts as a historical marker so that something of the such can never happen again. And if we erase it from the records, people will forget that they existed, and it's not going to be taught in schools. And if we no longer have that historical marker to ensure that it never happens again, I am curious about erasing it, because my children need to know, their children's children need to know, and so that they could always take a stance so these covenants never happen again. And if we erase the history record, the land record of these covenants, I'm scared that history could repeat itself. But nonetheless, this presentation was excellent. The one question I do have is, how would you like the commissioners to use this information in moving forward and making decisions with regards to planning and parks in both of our counties? Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Bartley. I'm going to take my best stab at both of those, and then certainly hand it over to my director for the second one. I share a number of the thoughts that you've had about the land records, and I do stress when we go to community meetings, what I hear is that there is a profound desire on the part of neighborhoods and community members to be opening and welcome to all people who want to come and live in their neighborhoods. And there is a sense and a feeling that the existence of these covenants still in the land records creates a perception that people are not welcome to come and live in well-established, in older established neighborhoods, that it is not welcome for minorities, other racial or ethnic minorities, to come to Montgomery County. But I do stress to people when we give this presentation is that the covenant still exists in the land record. You cannot go back to the earliest platting and scratch it out of the book. That's not what this does. Basically, if you fill out the form, the attorneys, my understanding is that they go into the electronic record of someone's current deed as it exists, like the deed book for their purchase and transfer, and the covenant is almost like blacked out like a marker, but on the computer screen. The physical book where the covenant was transcribed at the time of subdivision isn't touched. So someone can still pull title back to see, and that even in and of itself is a marker. If you're, if you strike the covenant and then the property is sold 2-3 down the line, and there's still this sort of black marker thing, you can still continue to pull title back to see the initial covenant. In terms of using it going forward, we used this, for example, as part of our upcoming Tacoma Park minor master plan amendment that the Montgomery County Planning Board is going to see that in September. We now have, for example, a much deeper understanding of the African American community within the plan boundary, and we used some of this information to write a historic site designation report associated with the African American community and with environmental justice issues that they faced related to the siting of a park for the African American children, a community center, and then also an incinerator that was put in their neighborhood to a recycling area. So we're using that to have a deeper context and understanding of the communities that live here in Montgomery County for right now. But I'll turn it over again to Director Stern and my division chief, Jason Sartori, for their thoughts.
Sure. If I could real quickly, Jason Sartori, Chief of Countywide Planning and Policy here at the Montgomery County Planning Department. I just wanted to add to that and to Commissioner Bartley's point. I think this project is a perfect example of how we will ensure this information never gets lost, right? I think there are a lot of people who don't know today that they're, homeowners today that have no idea that their property might have these covenants on their land records. I don't know all the covenants that exist on my deed, right? And so while this wasn't a parcel by parcel analysis, it did look at subdivisions, and now people have this information and have access to this to know, hey, my neighborhood, these covenants existed. I know that this is likely on my deed. And so just having this information, and this is education in itself, and it ensures that no matter what, whether people work to fill out that form to strike these restrictive covenants from their deed going forward, it's documented here in this project.
And I would say that what Jason just said was the first thing I was going to say, which is that, you know, your concern, Commissioner Bartley, this type of project is intended to help make sure that we document this history in Montgomery County, again, so that it won't be forgotten. And I think, you know, Rebecca could note, as we've given presentations and talked to others about this project, you know, this is one of those things where my sense is some people thought that maybe Montgomery County didn't really have these types of covenants. And so we did this work and said, yes, the county did have these covenants. They do exist in our land records. And so a lot of this is very much about education and documenting that history so that it doesn't disappear and that it then becomes a resource for others to use to do that education. Rebecca mentioned the Capital Jewish Museum has an exhibition that included this data. So, you know, that's very much the value of this type of project. It's very much for our use, for the planning department and for the commission, but we intend for these to be used by the public to help to spread this knowledge. And secondly, you know, in addition to what Rebecca noted in terms of how we use this for the Tacoma Park minor master plan, we didn't go through this as part of this presentation, but there was a part two where our Research and Strategic Projects Division, in response to a question that we heard when we did this presentation earlier to the planning board, you know, so what does this mean with regards to the people who live in those communities now? Did these racially restricted covenants have an effect on the demographics of the current residents? And so, so that division within our department, you know, did the analysis, and long story short, it's very difficult to show a direct correlation between the existence of racially restrictive covenants in a particular subdivision on who lives there now. As you know, we all know, with the Federal Fair Housing Act, and a lot of other changes that have occurred over the decades, you know, residents have the ability to live in a lot of different areas. We've had a lot of you know, growing racial and ethnic diversity in Montgomery County as well over the intervening decades. And so it's very difficult to say, you know, if the parcel within a particular subdivision on this parcel of a racially restrictive covenant existed in the land records, does that mean that the residents who live there may not be, you know, Black or other people of color? As we know, some of the areas that did have racially restrictive covenants are now actually very diverse in terms of who lives there now. So we have that, an additional staff report. Rebecca mentioned it earlier. We're happy to share that with the commission if you all are interested in looking at that. But again, part of this is helping the county have a more accurate history of what happened as this county developed and grew over the 20th century, and also making sure that, number one, we can acknowledge that history, whether it's through our master plans or through exhibitions or other ways to share that knowledge, but also to make sure that we are aware of the patterns of development as we develop recommendations for master plans moving forward. That's why master plans always have not just an existing conditions, but also trying to document what was the history of development in that community, because it'll help us to determine, to look at the conditions on the ground now, who lives there now, and if there are some dynamics from that past history that have directly impacted in one form or fashion, you know, how that community developed over time.
Thank you. Commissioner Linden?
Yes, thank you. I also just wanted to share my thanks and appreciation for Ms. Ballo, you and your team, the researchers, the analysts, the planners, everyone else who participated in this project. It sounds like truly a Herculean effort, given everything you described. And the county will benefit for such a long time from this. It's rare, as you mentioned, particularly with government agencies, due to lack of resources and time and other priorities. And it's often kind of volunteer driven, as you mentioned, or you know, academic researchers get involved on their end. But this is truly amazing, and so thank you. And it brings up another question related to Director Stern, what you mentioned about the recent presentation to council. They were interested in kind of the updated scope potential funding coming through with, I guess, FY 2024. And I'm wondering do you have any anything to share potentially about what your next areas of inquiry might be? It sounds like perhaps there's interest elsewhere in the county, mid-county or up-county. I'm also curious about any potential follow-up efforts with the down-county findings that you've uncovered and areas of inquiry there that could be explored. If council, I'm hopeful that they do. If they happen to come back with less funding than you would like, I'm wondering if you've looked into other potential funding sources, like for example, universities giving out grants for this type of thing, maybe in collaboration with researchers there, or even through the federal government. I'm sure there's grant programs either through HUD or other agencies that could support this kind of work. And then finally, I'm kind of piling the questions. Director Stern, your latest comment triggered this thought in my mind. Establishing the correlation between these covenants and existing demographic conditions seems difficult, but I'm curious if there's been any look into correlation between these areas with the covenants and existing property values to see if there's kind of ongoing systemic effects that relate to housing affordability in any given way. And that seems like, who knows what that would find, but it seems like that could potentially have some relevance as well for the department, for the board, for policymakers moving forward. So thank you again. I'll end it there.
So I will maybe ask Rebecca if you could speak to the question about grants. We certainly are very interested in pursuing other funding opportunities when possible. So I'll tackle the other two questions. And so in terms of next steps, again, we just had this discussion with the PHP committee with the Montgomery County Council on Monday, and there are a lot of ideas that were shared in terms of a potential phase 2 for this project, as well as other areas of interest that they had. And so we committed to go back and kind of digesting that and thinking about number one, what could a phase 2 scope be, but also what are some other potential research or project ideas. I also noted that some of the ideas that they mentioned maybe ones where we can work with other agencies, such as the Office of Legislative Oversight, which is a part of the Support State County Council as well. So we don't have an answer for that, because we are going to be having an upcoming discussion internally to kind of think through all those different ideas. And the third thing you mentioned is actually a very interesting question, and I think we could add that to the mix of other kind of potential research ideas to see if that's something that maybe that could be explored. We did hear from the council members on the PHP committee an interest in understanding or looking at how looking at the appraisals and valuations of properties, particularly those that are owned by Black and Latino residents. And we know that there have been at times patterns when those properties are undervalued relative to similar properties. We did share a separate research effort that was done by the University of Maryland's National Center for Smart Growth that did do an analysis looking at that for the state. But again, that's an interesting question that we can, again, kind of throw in the mix and see what can come out of it.
And I could add that, there was a study in Minneapolis, I believe, where they've done parcel by parcel analysis, where they were able to show some relationship between where these covenants existed and home values, property values today. We were not able to do that. We did it at a high level. We kind of looked at it in the same way we tried to see if there was any correlation with demographics in communities today. We looked to see if the neighborhoods or the census tracts where we saw the existence of the covenants, whether that had any correlation to property values as reported through the census, and we couldn't find anything there. And part of it is because what we saw in our down county area was that these were pervasive. They were everywhere across the county. I mean, it wasn't just all concentrated in one area. And then there have also been a lot of things that have happened since, the 1960s that have impacted how demographically our county has grown. And so I think, and we don't really have the ability to get down to that parcel by parcel analysis, but we can try to take a closer look at some of this. One of the other things that that did come up in that the council discussion earlier this week was it was Council Member Jawando talked about kind of the evolution of segregation in the county and segregationist practices and how you went from slavery to Jim Crow to these types of restrictive covenants to redlining our single family zoning, and then even after that through HOA covenants and things that have had some restrictive type of component. And so one of the things we may look at is, we've talked about potentially expanding the scope geographically, but also maybe looking at what are some of those other types of practices that somehow have made our neighborhoods and our communities exclusive or restrictive in some way, and what impact have those had on how the county has grown demographically.
I also wanted to, just mention one thing that Rebecca talked about earlier as part of the research. There are subdivisions that have covenants that related to how much the property or the home should cost when it was built at the time, and to ensure whether it's particularly if it was a single family home, saying that only a single family home could be built here and it had to have been built at a certain dollar amount, back in the decade from when the covenant was initially put in place. And so that may exist even if there isn't a racially restrictive covenant. So that really demonstrated that there was an intention to make sure that only people who could afford a home of that price could actually live there, rather than, enabling subdivision and then you just build whatever, the developer decides to build. So that's another factor, that could be considered in looking at, sort of the economic value of those communities now, because there was an intention to economically segregate that community when that subdivision was created, where those types of covenants existed.
I'd like to add one last thought to that, and then also speak to the grants really quickly. There is a really urgent need, I think, to undertake this type of original research and think about the suburbs in a different way. Because one of the issues that I think, that I know our research team ran into here as opposed to in Minnesota, is that there were not enough like-kind properties to undertake that kind of, the appraisals are built on, comparing this ranch house to that ranch house, more or less the same number of bedrooms, same size, roughly the same age. The Black population was so small in Montgomery County in relation to the larger numbers in 1960. The story here is more of keeping people out of the county and preventing people who were already here from expanding into newer areas. So, for example, in Richmond or in Baltimore or even in Minneapolis, you have much larger urban African American neighborhoods next to white neighborhoods, ethnically Polish or Italian or whatever, where the housing stock in a sense is comparable. This row house neighborhood more or less next to this row house neighborhood. And so the study that Jason had mentioned, which is included as a footnote in the second staff report that Director Stern had mentioned that we'll send to everybody, they were able to do that kind of comparable analysis because the building stock was similar. And we just found early on we don't have these kinds of numbers here, which makes us think, how are we going to get creative in creating a different kind of methodology to maybe look at this issue the same way that the historians had to create our own methodology to really dig into the covenants? So it's a really fascinating question that we've been looking at. Also for grants, my office routinely applies to the state, to the Maryland Historical Trust, for grants for designating properties and for certain types of research. For example, when I presented last month on the LGBTQ project, that was a grant-funded project from the state. this isn't quite in their wheelhouse. I have looked at the National Endowment for the Humanities grants. There are a number of grant programs that this might qualify for. However, we were still really looking at the council because it would still be such a large work program item. For example, even if I were to apply for it and receive maybe several $100,000 from the feds, their reporting requirements are one thing, but we really do want the buy-in from the council and the board that this is an important part of the work program that's funded, and the staff years and time are then devoted to the management for it. But your point is very well taken, and I have been researching other grant sources as well. So thank you.
Thank you. We have a few more questions from commissioners. Commissioner Dorner, and then I think Commissioner Bartley has his hand up again.
All right, so I want to thank you, first off, for doing the research and sharing it. I have a couple of questions and kind of comments because I've actually been a little bit plugged into some of these issues. The one is actually unrelated to this, but related to sort of racial discrimination or kind of patterns in history. I just wanted to find out, I know, and the other commissioners and others may not be aware of what you were doing before on changing street names that had like Confederate names and stuff like that. I wanted to find out if Montgomery County was still doing that or if they had kind of finished and stopped that database, because for a bit I think you guys were going through and trying to find out what street names have been changed recently and kind of the movement to remove Confederate soldiers and generals and stuff from the county, and you were working on trying to create just the data or GIS layers around that. So are you still doing that, or is that kind of paused and transitioned into this project?
So that project, I'll definitely let Director Stern pick up that answer. For our part, that project has stopped. We had noted for several efforts, we didn't receive any additional any funding from the council to undertake that research request, but we did pull together and do our best to answer the question about what streets were named after Confederates and which ones could then plausibly, could then have their names changed. We still have that database internally. We have the GIS map internally. It is still used as a research tool for the historians, and we still do field requests from the public from time to time and give them information about their streets, but we are not undertaking any additional research on that project at this time.
So as part of that project back in 2020 and 2021, which was when we initially got the request from the county council, basically, as a part of that research, we found 3 streets in Montgomery County that had full name matches to Confederate soldiers, so we knew that the street was definitely named after those individuals. And we have already worked with, they were all actually in this one community, so we already completed the street renaming for those 3 streets. We also did a separate street renaming that was not related to that project, but was a separate request from the county council to rename Montrose Parkway to the Josiah Henson Parkway, which is also now completed. And as Rebecca mentioned, we do occasionally get inquiries or suggestions from community members about streets in their particular communities that may have that may be named after Confederates, or in one instance, Confederate horses. So we do have kind of an additional list of other potential places to be researched. We also recently got an inquiry from some community members who may choose to pursue their renaming themselves, because community members can initiate renamings themselves. It isn't something that the planning department necessarily has to initiate. We're the ones who are responsible for actually implementing it. And so we are continuing in that vein, but again, as Rebecca mentioned, we don't have any additional resources to do more research at this point. It's really more because there were a lot of streets that had last name matches to Confederate soldiers and slaveholders on the within a database that we developed, but that is not necessarily a guarantee that that street was actually named after those individuals, and it would require a lot more research to be able to determine whether or not that was the case. We do know of some instances where there may be a last name match, but there is documentation that street was actually named after a different individual who is not a Confederate or a slaveholder. So that is where we would need some additional resources in order to continue that research.
Okay, fair enough. So I just want to point out, because a question was raised a couple of times, and actually mention was made of the Minneapolis study. So I run on my other job. I have a research group that I run, and I used to do all the house price indices for the country. And we actually brought in one of the authors on that paper a couple weeks ago to present. And what they find is that so this will help you in some of your talking points as you go forward and you're chatting with people. One of the things, Rebecca, that you mentioned was like just a small sample size. I'm not actually concerned about that from like an empirical standpoint, because the Minneapolis sample actually has quite a few less. What they're doing, and they're drawing from the mapping prejudice program that that was done in Hennepin County and the surrounding counties in the MSA. But when they're doing their empirical analysis, they're looking at a couple hundred properties that were before and after the 1948 Supreme Court decision, and then they're looking forward and using like 2010 census data to figure out, okay, what happened immediately after the Supreme Court decision, and then what happened sort of long term. And what they're finding is that the effects on prices are fairly small. So if you look at census tracts or the essential of neighborhoods in areas, and you're comparing census tracts that had the covenants versus ones that did not, the ones that had the covenants have about a 3 to 5% higher house price over the long term in terms of what they were priced at, which is sort of makes sense if you're trying to discriminate and keep people out, then you might pay a premium on that because you have a limited supply. And then the other sort of finding that's more notable is the long-term effect. So if you look at census tracts that had the covenants versus those that did not, the ones that had the covenants end up having around, depending on what statistic you look at, between 15 to 20% lower either home ownership rates or inclusion of African Americans in those areas. So it certainly locked out people initially, like before the Supreme Court decision, and then it took some transition time to open up those neighborhoods. But there's actually a long-term effect that is pretty robust empirically when you go through some pretty complicated regression discontinuities and other sort of statistical methods, that it stands up. And I was surprised, honestly, that the long-term effects stayed that long. Some of it may be because Minneapolis has a long history of sort of racial segregation. They built the highways right through some of the neighborhoods that had the covenants. There were certain school districts in areas that didn't receive funding, so you can have this sort of lack of infrastructure or different infrastructure that persists over time that creates these permanent kind of barriers to communities. But it certainly shows up in the census data 50, 60 years later, and maybe even more so when we start to look at like the 2020 data. But I just want to offer that up as sort of talking points when you're talking to the county council in terms of what can you measure, what can you look at. You could go back and you could get the rental rates based on like the scan census data that's up online, and you could look at how is the difference in terms of home ownership or renters within there. You could look at price differences, which would actually probably be a little bit easier to do because you could have the census data for right now, and you could just see like what are the price differences between areas that did and did not have those right now, and then what's the home ownership rates, and it may not be quite as big in Montgomery County, but it's worth taking a look at because that's something that would be interesting to document and just know about. Questions I had, so I also messaged you, Rebecca, over Teams, so I gave you a couple of URLs. When you get the do not disturb thing off, you'll see them kind of pop up on your screen, so you have the URLs to kind of click through. What I was wondering about, like, in terms of like how you do this, what are sort of lessons learned about how you could do this potentially faster? Like if you were to go into the deeds, could you use like a sort of machine learning or some sort of a searching over the words to actually pull it out of the digitized deeds instead of the plats? Or are there ways that you think you could kind of speed this up so you could do potentially the rest of the county, but then also thinking ahead for funding opportunities if you have sort of like a mechanism that you could do that and it doesn't require as much like personnel power or hours, you might be able to do this for Prince George's as well, because the nice thing about the commission is we're by county, and we would have the Parks Department be able to contribute or work with you if you were able to get the funding and find a way to kind of do it more quickly. And as a researcher on my side job, one of the things that interests me is just data. But I need data that's comprehensive. So having a part of a county is good, but it's not good enough for what I would want to do for a metro area. I would want to see the whole county, and I'd want to see probably 2 counties. Prince George's County would be great because it's, prior to the most recent census, was the most wealthiest county with the majority of African American population in the country. So if you put that into like a research journal or research circles or policy circles, it sort of really calls to attention because both counties are very wealthy and have potentially high minority concentrations in income in Prince George's. So it's going to really call to attention people's interest within there about why they should focus on this particular area, even if we can't get DC to kind of contribute to these sorts of things. So one of my questions, and I'll ask the other one in just a second, is basically the speed. Do you have ways that you think you could do this faster? And then the other question is, what are the next steps? Where do you want to place this report, or what are you thinking about it? Because I would encourage you, even without getting the rest of the county, you could take this and you could put it in HUD's Cityscape Journal or other journals, and they would probably be very interested in this. HUD has opportunities for, one of their focuses on closing the homeownership ratio gap, and they're very focused on this, and they would probably be very interested in a study like this, and I'm happy to connect you with the editor of the journal and the others to like talk more through it. To see if this would be of what they're thinking about and what they would kind of accept. I special edited a journal for them last year, so I kind of have some feel for like what they would want, and I think this would probably be quite of interest. Even with like a limited study within a one county, within part of a county, I think it still would be something, because of the gargantuan effort, that they would be extremely interested in knowing about.
Let me, Rebecca, if I can maybe start with addressing your last point, Commissioner Joyner. In terms of sort of next steps, in terms of sharing this work, we definitely appreciate the idea of leveraging this work with HUD resources and kind of communication channels. We certainly, because we are planners, this type of work is something that we definitely want to share with our peers, not only in this region but also nationally. Our local chapter of the American Planning Association, which is a national organization, professional membership organization for planners, they have an annual conference in the fall. Our department typically presents usually multiple sessions at the local conference, and they just open up session proposals, so that's definitely something that we will look at. We also present our work at the National APA Conference, which is typically in the spring. We typically again, usually have sessions that share our work pretty much every year at that conference. And so, because particularly within a planning profession, everybody is very much looking at equity, and also, not just looking at it at a very high level, but how can we integrate it into our work, and what are some different tools to do that. And so we have a lot of tools that we've already developed and have already been sharing some of that work, but that's another way for us to share it with our peers nationally, and also to learn from other jurisdictions that are embarking on this work. But again, we definitely will be happy to follow up with you on that HUD opportunity. And I will turn it back over to Rebecca in terms of the question about speed.
Thank you. That's an excellent question, Commissioner Joyner, about how we could speed this up. When we were looking at it initially, we got in touch with our colleagues at the Maryland State Archives, who they've digitized this data, and asking them for their ideas about how we might use computer AI or machine learning for keyword searches. And our project lead, John Lieberts, is not on the call, and he definitely understands the particulars of this. So if I butcher this, then I apologize. But it had to do with the way when we were going to the land records, we are pulling the data off of their server sort of through the internet. We could not get access to the servers that actually keep all the scanned data from the books. So the pull was too laborious, and there was too much data to do that. And so there was a discussion very early on, like maybe could we try an MOU? We would need to have direct access, to the data in the scans to be able to run it through the AI. And we only had our term contract employees for 6 months. We only had the project scoped for a year, and we decided we didn't have the time, and so we moved on from that idea. Now, if the project were expanded either geographically or to your other point, if it expands to the bi-county region, and there is a data request coming from Montgomery and Prince George's County for this data to use for this particular project, then maybe the creation of an MOU so that we can have the data ourselves to kind of play around with and run through the keyword search. We would still need people, we would still need researchers to fact check every single one of those keyword polls, and we could work around some shortcuts maybe to transcribe the data. So there would still be a large staff component to it. But we did look at it at first. We didn't think it was feasible for this project, but if we were to move on, especially to expand it in some way, then to your point, I think we should come back to it and have more discussions with the state about the data.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good. So just 2 quick comments. If you do decide to put this in like Cityscape or kind of submit it there, you could still submit a subsequent article if you get the data for the rest of the county and do more work to JAPA or other stuff that like the APA's, like sort of flagship journal. Like if you expand it out later on, you can still submit it to other journals if you wanted to do that. So that's not going to necessarily restrict you in that way. And then in terms of like the machine learning side of it, you might want to, it might be helpful to reach out to the Mapping Prejudice folks who are doing this up in Minneapolis and see if they have lessons learned about like the best way or how long this would take, because they may have another methodology or way of doing this where they can scan in, they can do sort of fuzzy text messaging and stuff that they could just tell you, hey, this is like the best way to do it or the quickest way. And I don't think you would be at a loss of finding free labor or subsidized labor in the academic community. If you want to continue this, if you can get at least FTE hours supported by the county council for this, I think it would be relatively not easy, but it wouldn't be hard probably to find academics who would pitch in and bring their RAs and do this kind of stuff, because it's very interesting, and you could probably leverage off of their expertise. You have the connections, you've already done this, you kind of know what the deal is, and you could get them for helping with this, or even on even AI kind of machine learning stuff. There's all sorts of new techniques that people are using in academia, and this is like what you have PhD researchers who just dedicate themselves in their dissertations like doing very archaic kind of like methodology, and you could probably find one that would be very good at this. I can connect you with the authors too on that study. If you're not already in contact with them, and just see if they have other thoughts or ideas as well offline later. But yeah, great work on
appreciate
all
that.
this.
Thank you.
And I appreciate that very much. We reached out to them in the beginning, and we do owe them a check-in now. And you're right, we'll definitely check in with them about the methodology. Thank you. I'm sorry, Director Stern.
Sure. I was going to say, just given the interest in looking at whether or not this is something that could be done for Prince George's County, we can also, have conversations with the other half of the commission, with the Prince George's Planning Department and Parks and Recreation Department and our historians, to see if there's interest, ability, capacity to expand this work so that, we could potentially work across the commission to further this.
Yeah, we would look forward to that. That sounds great. Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Dorner. Commissioner Bartley.
I just wanted to point out something that I don't want this study to paint our county in a negative light. I found Montgomery County always welcoming, despite the past history of racial covenants. And currently, the population in the county is mostly minority. And although this county did have a sordid history with regards to racial covenants, I don't believe that they are enforced today, and that my experience in the county, I've been able to move, travel, and live wherever I wanted to live. And so Montgomery County is a great place to live and a great place to buy a home and raise a family, regardless of our past history. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Appreciate it. Any other questions by commissioners? Seeing none, I would associate myself with all the remarks and questions by all the commissioners. This was truly fascinating. It's an impressive amount of work. Look forward to the continuing work, and we really appreciate you taking the time to bring this to us. So if there's nothing else, then we will end this discussion item. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Director Stern, and to your team.
Thank you.
And Commissioners, the only other things on our agenda are the officers' reports. We have the Executive Director's report. There's the late evaluation report. This is for information only. I don't think our Executive Director has anything to bring to us on that. Do you have
Correct.
something you'd like to bring?
No, this is just for information only, for your
Okay.
review.
Thank you, Ms. Chang-Smith. The Secretary Treasurer has no report scheduled, and our General Counsel, Ms. Borden, anything you want to bring to our attention related to the litigation report, or is it just for our information only?
It's for your information only. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you. Commissioners, have no questions for any of our officers. Then, Ms. Chang-Smith, Mr. Adams, any further business before us? No further business before us. Then, Commissioners, without objection, we are adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.